This is a story about how I became a psychologist. Let me go take you back to before I went to college. My father was a dentist, and my grandfather, my dad's dad, was a physician. And my dad actually died when I was 6 years old. Um, but my mom and I would go down to his office back in the days when people only had one car. And, my mother would take him and drop him off at work in the morning so she could have the car during the day. And I would go with her to pick him up. And, he would always, every night, check my teeth and give me a ride up and down in his dental chair. And then when that was over, he had a special toy drawer for kids that were good. And I said, "Can I get something out of the toy drawer?" What I would tell you is I had raided the toy drawer for all the good stuff. I feel sorry for his actual patients. There weren't very many good things left in the toy drawer. He also had these little statues of Disney characters and things that he made out of plaster in his lab, and they were some of the most popular things that kids would pick after their appointment. So my dad was kind of my idol, but he died when I was 6 years old, and he was only 40. My grandfather, the physician, died before I was even born, so I didn't know him. But I had some of his stuff. I had his doctor bag and his stethoscope. In fact, to this day, I still have that stethoscope and a number of things like that. And so anyway, I grew up with this idea that someday I was going to be a dentist like my father or a physician like my grandfather. And I went off to college at Baylor University. And a couple of the reasons I chose Baylor was, one, they had a dental school. This was in 1968 that I started college. Baylor had a dental school, which was in Dallas. And they had a medical school in Houston. The main campus where you studied pre-medicine or pre-dentistry was in Waco. And so, I went to school in Waco. I was on the golf team in high school, and I loved playing golf. And I also had these notions that I was going to be able to play golf year round in Texas. I grew up in Wisconsin, so, during the winter there's no golf, but in Texas you could play. So, I had great expectations. And I started out at Baylor as a biology major, knowing that I could go in either direction, medicine or dentistry, with that. I wasn't doing very well in my classes. And it wasn't because I didn't study hard. In fact, I studied, it seemed like, all the time. I just didn't study right. I had prepared myself to take a lot of, I had been kind of told in high school that when you get to college, the classes are so big, the tests are all multiple choice and stuff. And I was always ready for a multiple choice test, but almost never did I have a multiple choice test. They were always essay tests, and you really needed to organize your thoughts and all of that. I was making a lot of mediocre grades, and changed my major at one point from biology into psychology. But then I was, instead of biology pre-dent or pre-med, I was psychology pre-dent. Well, I had to take tons of lab courses, zoology and general biology and chemistry, qualitative and quantitative analysis, and all these courses. And to be a psych major, you also had to have uh, what I call Rat Lab 101, where it was experimental psychology, and you had to take statistics, which had a lab. And I thought, there's just too many labs. And so then I changed my major to sociology. And I was like, well, I'll be sociology pre-dent or pre-med. Because sociology didn't have all those labs. And so I thought, okay, I'll major in sociology and I'll minor in psychology. By minoring in psychology, you could handpick the psychology courses you wanted. And so I took all the clinically oriented courses. I took personality and abnormal and counseling and things like that. And I didn't take experimental and testing and all these other classes that had labs. And so, I was moving along, and, I was getting to be about my junior year, and I was making some really good grades in courses that medical schools and dental schools didn't really care about. and in all those core science courses, I had a solid C average. Well, that wasn't going to get me into dental school. And people would often say to me, well, if you don't go to dental school, what do you think you'd like to do? And I thought about that. And I thought about where my strengths were and my interests were. And one of my interests was in working with children. Having grown up without a dad, I spent a lot of time down at the YMCA, and I spent a lot of time at city parks and playgrounds, and I really identified with the leaders there. And in fact, in high school, I ended up working at the YMCA as a youth worker. And in the summers when I was in college, I was a playground director. And so, I really enjoyed working with children, and I really enjoyed psychology. And I thought, maybe I'd like to be a child psychologist. I also was a very good speaker. In fact, something that turned the tide for me academically was after I took a couple of courses in speech. I took one course called Speech for Business and Professional Students. It was geared for people that were going to become professionals, like physicians or dentists and things like that. And I enjoyed that course so much, and I excelled so much at it, that I took another course from the same professor called Extemporaneous Speaking, where you learn to speak from an outline. And I excelled at that. And I thought, you know what? What I'd really like to do is be a professor of child psychology. But there was a problem with that, in that this was at the height of the Vietnam War. And I had a student deferment to go to college, but once you graduate from college, that was it. You got drafted into the Army, or if you were smart, you would enlist in whatever you wanted to enlist in. I was considering the Air Force because I love airplanes. And you couldn't go to graduate school in psychology. They had a special draft for doctors and dentists that you could go to medical school, you could go to dental school, and then have to go in the service. But you couldn't go straight from undergraduate into graduate school. You would have had to go into service first. And I just thought, if I finish my bachelor's degree with a major in sociology and a minor in psychology, and then go into the service for however many years, I think if you enlist, it was 4 to 6 years or something. By the time I'm finished, I can't picture myself then going back to school. I want to go straight through school. So I was really torn. And then the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, changed the draft. And he came up with this lottery system, and there was this evening where they had, like a big jar full of beans with birth dates on it. And, out of 365 days out of the year, I guess 366 for leap year, somebody reached in that jar and came out with a bean or whatever it was. And, it had a birth date on it. And they were going to draft people in that order. Well, my birthday, the number that came out was number 307 out of 365. So I dropped my student deferment and I went for the highest group that would get drafted, the 1A classification. But to get to me, they had to go through 306 other people this year. And then after this year, then the next year they'd go through 365 people and another 306. So to make a long story short, I was home free. I wasn't going to be faced with the military. And the pressure was off. There was no way I was going to get into dental school or medical school. And I had kind of forgot about the medical school thing. I was focusing more on dentistry at that point, and I thought, I'm just going to go full speed ahead now and get a doctorate in psychology with the idea of becoming a child psychologist and eventually a college professor. Well, my senior year of college, I took the graduate record exam, which is kind of a graduate school admissions test, if you will, an aptitude test. And I just did okay. I mean, I scored in the average range. And if you stop and think about it, scoring in the average range, that's a pretty good score, really. Because who takes the graduate record exam, The cream of the crop, a bunch of people who think they want to go on to graduate school. And so if you take the cream of the crop and then you compare yourself to them and you're average, well, you're pretty good, really. But I don't think any of the graduate admissions committees were impressed with my score. And then my overall grade point average wasn't that impressive because although I had made some very good grades, particularly my last 2 years at college, those first 2 years when I was taking all those pre-medical, pre-dental courses and had produced, just not very good grades at all, I didn't have an impressive grade point average, and and my GRE scores were just okay. One of the schools that I wanted to get into was the University of Minnesota, where coincidentally my grandfather had gone to medical school. And there was a place there called the Institute of Child Development, and they probably had the premier child psychology program in the country at the time. And to apply there, I also had to take this thing called the Miller's Analogies test, which I did pretty good on. But to make a long story short, I not only was rejected by the graduate program at the University of Minnesota, but I was rejected by every program I applied at. And I had applied at, outstanding programs. Well, what do you do with a bachelor's degree in sociology? It wasn't in social work, it was in sociology. Where, I took courses like race and ethnic relations and urban sociology, the sociology of cities and social problems and, marriage and the family and, these juvenile delinquency courses that were fascinating courses, but they didn't really qualify me to be anything. And then, I had minored in psychology, but here I had been rejected by everywhere I had applied. And so, what are you going to do? So, I thought about it, and I decided, I love flying. One of my closest friends in high school's dad had an airplane, and he and I used to fly in it all the time, all over the place. And in fact, because I spent so much time in the plane, and in the evenings, I was taking ground school classes at the technical college in my hometown. But I couldn't become a commercial pilot at that time because this was like 1972. Back then, to be a commercial pilot, you had to have 20/20 uncorrected vision. Well, as you can see, I don't have 20/20 uncorrected vision, and I didn't back then. Nowadays, pilots fly around with glasses on, but back then they didn't. So I couldn't become a pilot, but I loved flying. I got the brilliant idea, I'm going to be a flight attendant. Men were just beginning to become flight attendants in those days. It was pretty much of an occupation that was dominated by women. But I thought, that way I can fly and so on. But on the other hand, I really wanted to be a child psychologist. And so, it was frustrating. Well, I became angry about it. And I went out to Lake Waco, to a cove where I like to go, sometimes with friends, but a lot of times just to be alone, to meditate and pray and things like that. I went out to this cove, which ironically was right by the Waco airport. And I was yelling at God. If anybody had seen me, they would have thought I was completely crazy. But, I started out praying, Lord, I thought, you wanted me to, I felt like my life was, you were leading me in the direction of being a child psychologist, and now I'm not prepared to be anything, but my prayer kind of turned into shouting instead of humbly praying. If I was God, I would have went zap. You're gone. You ungrateful person, you. So I'm chucking rocks into the lake, and I'm yelling things. I'm pretending I'm a flight attendant, and I'm shouting things like, "Can I get you a newspaper, or would you like another Coke, or?" Oh, you're a little chilly. Can I get you a blanket? And I would chuck another rock into the lake, and I was just screaming at God, I went home, and I made plans the next day. This was a Tuesday. I made plans the next day to go to Dallas, where American Airlines had their flight academy, and I was going to talk to somebody about the process of becoming a flight attendant. Well, that next day, that Wednesday, there was a university carnival going on called Dia de l'Oso. Baylor has this tradition in the spring. Dia de l'Oso is the day of the bear. And instead of there being classes, right in the middle of the week, they had this carnival. And on Dia de l'Oso is when they always voted on, in the student elections for the coming school year. I might add, my junior year at Baylor, I managed to get elected vice president of the junior class. And at the end of that year, I decided to run for student congress representing the College of Arts and Sciences. Well, I didn't win the election. A friend of mine by the name of Danny Pleitz ran for student body president. And Danny had ideas that students bought hook, line, and sinker. He was a typical guy who was, criticizing the school administration about this and that. And of course, students felt that way about everything. And so Danny got elected. After he got elected, he called me up and he said, I know you wanted to get elected to student congress, and he would have been the president of the student congress. He said, but I'd like to appoint you to something. And I said, okay. And he said, so I'd like to appoint you the student representative to the disciplinary action committee. This is if a student was in deep trouble for whatever, there would be a committee that would meet that had faculty on it, and like the dean of students and people like that. And if it was a guy in trouble, then I was on the committee representing students. If a woman was in trouble, then a female representative was on the committee. And I told him, that's not exactly what I had in mind, but I said, I'll do it if you want. By the way, what really got Danny elected was he had this, well, I don't know what to call it, his platform, I guess you could call it, was he wanted to establish a student faculty senate. At that time, there was the faculty senate where the faculty, everybody in the faculty would get together and discuss campus politics and policies and things like that. And then there was a student body legislature which did the same thing. But, there wasn't any interaction between the two, and, really what the students decided didn't matter. What the faculty decided mattered. And Danny wanted to create a student faculty senate, which was a joint policy-making body composed of students and faculty. Well, the administration wouldn't go for something like that, but the students thought it was great. So Danny got elected in a landslide. Well, he called me back after I said, yeah, I'll be on the committee, the Student Disciplinary Action Committee, but it's not exactly what I want to do. He called me back maybe 10 minutes later and he said, I've got another position for you. He said, I want to make you chair of the Committee on Intercollegiate Affairs. This is the top post in the presidential cabinet. I would be Baylor's representative to all the other colleges in the country. You were essentially Secretary of State, if you will, if you wanted to look at it on a national politic level. And he said, the main thing I want you to do, he knew that I was into research. In fact, I was taking a course in social research. He said, I want you to do a comparative study of student government in America. Wow. So I did this study where I sent out questionnaires to student body presidents all over the country, all sorts of different size colleges, everything from, Harvard to UCLA to the University of Texas to small colleges to medium-sized private colleges, which is what Baylor was. And then I also did research on the background, trying to identify colleges that were experiencing a lot of campus violence and unrest at the time. Again, this was at the height of the Vietnam War. Students were taking over university presidents' offices, and they had sit-ins everywhere. And, a lot of it was about racial relations. A lot of it was about the war in Vietnam. There were all these student demands going on places. And, I sent questionnaires to all of those kind of colleges. Anyway, to make a long story short, I put together my findings in a document that was almost 50 pages long. And basically my research showed that colleges that didn't have a lot of campus violence and seemed to be functioning quite well tended to have student faculty senate instead of what Baylor had. So anyway, I took this 50-page typed report, which by the way, I had to do a paper for my social research class anyway, so this was it. I took my paper and I dropped it off at the university president's office. And, a few days later, I got a call from his administrative assistant who said, President McCall has read your report and he would like you to present your findings to the faculty. And so I was invited to speak to the entire Baylor faculty, which was in this huge lecture hall in the business school. All the Baylor professors, the whole front row was made up of the president, the executive vice president, the dean of the graduate school, all these kind of people. And, I'm standing up in front of all these people presenting my research findings. And, it wasn't a long talk. It was about 15 minutes. And, they thanked me and, I left. And when it was all over, the president called up Danny and said, okay, you can have your student faculty senate. It was like, it was my study that did it. So anyway, back to where I left off with this rabbit trail, but it is necessary to describe this because it had a big impact. So, I had been out at the lake chucking rocks in the water and yelling at God. And I was going to Dallas to see about becoming a flight attendant. But before I went, I wandered over to, the part of campus where the carnival was going on, Dia de Loso, so that I could vote in the election. And I'm standing in line waiting to vote, and a guy by the name of Dr. A.A. Hayden, who was he was like vice president of academic advisement or something like that. He was standing next to me in line, and he struck up a conversation with me. And how did he know me? Because he was on the front row when I presented my paper. And he said, so where are you going to grad school? And I said, well, I'm not. And he was like, you're not going to grad school? I had heard that you wanted to go to grad school and become a psychologist. And I said, well, it's kind of a long story, but to sum it up, I applied at a number of universities, and they all rejected me. And, it was primarily because I had a lot of mediocre grades when I was studying pre-dentistry. And so I'm not going. I got rejected everywhere. And he said, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I'm going to vote. And as soon as I'm done voting, I'm going up to Dallas to the American Airlines Flight Academy and see if I can become a flight attendant. Because, obviously I'm not going to be a psychologist. And Dr. Hayden, he said to me, rather than go to Dallas, he said, you can go to Dallas another day. You don't have to do it today. Would you be willing, instead of going to Dallas, coming to by my office this afternoon and talking some more about this? I said, okay. So I didn't go to Dallas, and I stopped by his office, and I told him my whole story in depth And he said to me, well, would you consider going to graduate school here? And I said, sure, I would love to go here. I said, but I got rejected by the psych department here too. They had a brand new Doctor of Psychology program in clinical psychology, and I had been rejected by that program too. In fact, everybody I knew at Baylor who applied to that program got rejected. Even people who had graduated, magna cum laude from the university got rejected. It's like they wanted to expand their reputation, I guess. They wanted to bring in people from all over the place. And so, none of us got in. People with way better grades than me didn't get in. So I told him, I applied to the PsyD program and I didn't get in there either. He said, well, what about educational psychology? Would you like to go to graduate school here in that? And I said, I didn't even know we had an educational psychology group. Most of the programs I had applied at were in educational psychology because that's where most of the child psychology work was focused. And so I said, I didn't even know we had a program here. Sure, I would be. He said, if you could get in here, would you be willing to go here? I went, oh, yeah, sure. So with me sitting in his office, he got on the phone and he called the Dean of Education. And he said to him, I've got this senior in my office. He's about to graduate from Baylor. And he's not prepared to do anything. And I get emotional when I talk about this. He said, I think Baylor owes him more than that. And he said, would you be willing to talk to him and listen to his story? The dean said, sure, send him up. So I went up there. I was in his office for, I bet you, 2 hours. And he was just poring over my transcripts and everything. And after 2 hours with this wonderful gentleman, Dr. L.V. McNamee was his name, he decided that based on my grades the last 2 years at Baylor and my rather good score on the Miller's Analogies test, which I had to take to go to the University of Minnesota Institute of Child Development, that he would let me in on probation. With the stipulation that, I would go to summer school and take several courses and make A's in those. And if it was okay with the graduate dean. Well, I knew that wasn't going to be an issue because the graduate dean's daughter was a sociology major. And in fact, she was a social work major, and I knew her quite well and had spent a fair amount of time over at their house. And he knew very well about my desire to go to graduate school in psychology. So, I went from the education dean's office to the graduate dean's office, and he too was on the front row when I presented my paper. And his attitude was, well, it's okay with the education dean, it's okay with me. He was surprised I hadn't gotten in any of those places I had applied. So I was in. And, I made A's in those courses that I took. And then I met Dr. Bill Lampkin, who was the chair of the Ed Psych department at Baylor. And, he ended up my main advisor and chair of my dissertation committee, my mentor, my favorite professor. Dr. Lampkin was an amazing human being. And he had total faith in me. He never once doubted my abilities, and so on. And so, I was in the program and I started working on a master's degree. And I borrowed money to pay my tuition. And I got a part-time job in the library where, I made about $100 a month. Well, they had a handful of graduate assistantships, where like you were a professor's assistant. That, and there weren't very many of them, only it seemed like maybe 3 or 4 positions like that. Most of them were like in the media center, helping faculty with media issues. And those positions paid your tuition and paid you $150 a month, which, in 1973, by this time, that was a decent amount of money. I sure would have liked to have had one of those, but, there were probably about 400 students in graduate school in education, and, not just Ed Psych. I mean, altogether, your chances of getting something like that were pretty slim. And there was this girl that worked in the library with me who got a different on-campus job, working as a part-time secretary in the dean's office. And I told her, boy, I'd love to have one of those assistantships, but she said, well, you should fill out an application. And I'm like, no way. I said, I'm lucky to even be in graduate school. I'm not about to go back and say to that wonderful man, I want a graduate assistantship. There's hundreds of grad students in education. They're not going to give me one. I'm not even going to get, this girl, her name was Donna. She picked up the application for me and brought it to me, and she said, fill it out. I went, okay. So I filled it out, and she took it and gave it to the dean. Well, looking over everything, one summer I had spent, again, I had worked with kids at the YMCA in high school, summers in college. I was a playground director. One summer I was a playground director for one whole semester and then a whole summer for a school that was nothing but kindergarten children in the Waco ISD. And so, to make a long story short, because of my strong background working with young kids, I got a graduate assistantship. And I was made the assistant to the professor, Professor Betty Baker, who was the head of the early childhood program. So, the second half of, well, the first year I worked on my master's, I worked in the library, but that second year, I was Betty Baker's assistant, and I assisted her in doing research. She would say, I would attend her classes and things. Particularly, she was teaching one course in educational psychology directed toward kindergarten children, and she would say, pick out a few topics that you'd like to lecture on and you teach class. And so, there were 4 or 5 topics that I taught the class. Well, I earned my master's degree in educational psychology, and I had been Betty Baker's assistant. And I wanted to go on and get a doctorate. Well, the dean didn't want me to go on and get a doctorate. He said, you need some practical experience first. But Dr. Lampkin, the chair of the department, he got on the phone to the dean, and it's like, if we're going to have a doctoral program in educational psychology with, in my case, a focus on school psychology, then, you've got to let him go straight into the program. Bless his heart, the dean caved in again. And thanks to Dr. Lampkin being on my side, who eventually became the associate dean of education. And after Dean McNamee retired, Dr. Lampkin became the dean. But that was after I was gone. But now I wanted a teaching fellowship. Like I said, there were only 2. I don't think there were more than maybe 3 graduate assistantships, teaching assistantships, teaching fellowships. This is where you taught an undergraduate course in educational psychology all by yourself. You were essentially a professor. There were, like maybe 4 people who had those kind of, 4 or 5 people that had those kind of teaching fellowships. And those paid $300 a month plus your tuition. So, I'm talking double the salary. $300 a month plus tuition at a private university. That's a pretty good deal, especially back in 1974 at this point. And so, I applied for a teaching fellowship. Well, the dean didn't really want to do that. He wanted me to be Professor Baker's assistant for another year. And, I went into his office. Bless his heart. He was the kindest man ever. Although I was terrified of him. I don't know why. He was just as nice as can be. I ended up having him for several classes. He specialized in teaching all the clinical reading courses, diagnosis and correction of reading difficulties. He was one of my favorite professors. He was absolutely dynamite as a professor. But, I was back in his office, and, I'm like begging him to let me teach a class because, I need the money. Yeah, I love working with Professor Baker, and, doing that another year would be okay, but I need the $300. I can't live on 150. And bless his heart, he caved in, and he let me. So I ended up on the course schedule teaching a course in educational psychology for elementary teachers. And I did that for 2.5 years. And received my doctorate. And my committee consisted of Dean McNamee, Dr. Lampkin, Dr. Strickland, who was noted as a stickler for precise writing. Everybody wanted him on their committee. It's like, if you can get your dissertation through Dr. Strickland, you can get it through anybody because it's going to be perfect. So I had him on my committee. You were supposed to have somebody from the outside on your committee, and I brought in the chair of the sociology department, Charles Talbert, and I also had Ralph Hausman. I know. No, he was on my preliminary committee. I had Raymond Biles on my committee. Anyway, these guys, I taught that course. I did my research. I published my dissertation. I earned my doctorate in December of 1976. One of the courses that I was taking in graduate school was a course in administration of individual intelligence tests, like the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children and the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scale, things like that. And it was a summer class, and it was taught by a guy by the name of Dr. Jack Ross. And he was an adjunct professor at Baylor. The professor who normally taught that course in the summer was going to be having some surgery. And so Jack was coming in to teach the class, and so that's who I had for the course. And he really liked what I was doing. He liked my work, and he was trying to talk me into being a school psychologist. He was the head of special ed at the Education Service Center, Region 12 in Waco, and he wanted me to work there. And so in my last semester at Baylor in graduate school, I was teaching educational psychology for elementary teachers. I was also supervising student teachers in kindergartens and teaching a seminar in student teaching for kindergarten student teachers. And I was also tutoring kids in reading after school. People that would inquire with Dean McNamee. One summer I worked in the Baylor Reading Clinic tutoring kids, and so he got me doing that also. So I was doing that, and then on top of that, I was working part-time as a school psychologist for Dr. Ross at the Education Service Center. But I was getting lots of experience administering psychological tests. So I finished my doctorate, and I was able to continue on then full-time working at the Education Service Center as a school psychologist. And this was also counting toward my internship that was necessary to get licensed as a psychologist in Texas. After I finished my master's degree, I took an exam with the State Board of Examiners of Psychologists to become what was known then as a psychological associate, which allowed me to become a school psychologist and do testing and things like that in the schools, or work under the supervision of a licensed psychologist. And Jack Ross was a licensed psychologist. So that was kind of the beginning of my internship, if you will. And of course, in graduate school, I had practicums where I went into the schools and did counseling and testing, and I went into the VA hospital and did group therapy and things like that. So, I was acquiring a fair amount of counseling experience, especially in the area of group work. So, and as a psych associate, I could work under the supervision of a licensed psychologist. But to actually get licensed myself, I had to take another exam. It's called the Examination for Professional Practice in Psychology, and it's absolutely one of the most awful tests you could ever have to take. Very, about 250 of the most ridiculous multiple choice questions you ever saw. So, you had to pass that, and then you had to have 2 years of supervised experience, either 2 years postdoc or 1 year pre-doc and 1 year postdoc. So, I was getting my, some of my pre-doc experience was before I got my doctorate, and then some of my postdoc experience was working at the service center after I got my doctorate. And, I enjoyed the work, but the position I had was based on a government grant, which was going to end at the end of the school year. So, I couldn't keep working at the service center. I was going to need to find another job. And I had applied for positions all over the place. I had applied for teaching positions, different places. I had applied for school psychology positions, counseling psychology positions. Some of those were in counseling centers at universities. Some of them were at school districts. And, I interviewed for any number of positions. I interviewed for positions at a number of colleges, like SMU, the University of Dallas, places like that, Tarrant County College. And positions as a school psychologist, places like the Austin ISD and the Dallas ISD and places like that. And I mainly wanted to live in Austin. When I was my second summer at college, my first summer I went home to Wisconsin, but my second summer I stayed in Waco. And I had a roommate who was from Austin, and one weekend we were out of food and out of money, and he said this would be a good weekend to visit my parents. I came down to Austin. I fell in love with Austin. I said, boy, that's where I'd like to live someday. And people would say, you'll never get a position in Austin. Everybody wants to live in Austin. You can forget that. I put together a resume and I filled out an application for the Austin ISD, and I geared everything toward, how much I wanted to be here. And but there weren't really any openings. There was one, but somebody else got it because they were bilingual and they needed somebody that could also speak Spanish, which made a lot of sense to me. I'm not bilingual, so I didn't get the position. But every once in a while I'd swing by. If I was in town, I would drop by the personnel office and say, "Hi, remember me? I still would like to work here." I got to meet the guy who was over everybody, Dr. Matt Snap, and he just seemed like a wonderful guy, somebody I would really like to work for. I got to meet Darlene Kaufman, who was the supervisor of testing and was kind of under Matt. And she just seemed like a wonderful person to work for. But they didn't really have any openings, and then I decided, well, maybe I'd rather go to Dallas. Some of my closest friends had moved to Dallas, and I was really trying to get a job in Dallas at that point, doing something in the field of psychology. And I remember one of the last interviews I had with the guy who was the head of psychological services for the Dallas ISD said, "Well, I heard they really want you in Austin." I said, "Well, they haven't hired me." So anyway, my position at the service center ended at the end of the school year, and I had been saving money. I had been putting half of my salary into savings, and I had some student loans to pay off, and I was hoping to make a big chunk at the end of the year. And I ended up living on my savings for that whole summer because I couldn't land a position anywhere. And some of the jobs I applied for, besides the ones I've already mentioned, I didn't even really want. But it was getting to the point where I just had to have something. I had to support myself. In fact, one of the interviews I had was to be a psychologist at the Dallas County Juvenile Center. I mentioned I kind of wanted to live in Dallas at that point. And the chief psychologist there was a guy I had gone to grad school with at Baylor, only he was in the Doctor of Psychology program. But a lot of those students would come over to Ed Psych to take electives because most of the child psych courses were in Ed Psych. So, these guys would come over there. So I knew him, and I thought, well, and we had a nice interview, but I didn't get the job. And boy, that was a creepy place. I remember they took me right into the cell block, and my office would have been basically a jail cell. Then to get in and out, a guard had to take you through it with keys and stuff. It was depressing. I didn't get the job. And then I had a job interview in Waco to be a drug rehab counselor. And I remember one of the questions the guy asked me, and I thought maybe I had a chance for this position because the the guy who was interviewing me was a psychologist, and he actually had grown up in the same hometown I had in Wisconsin. And his wife had been a grad student in ed psych at Baylor, and I knew her well. And I thought, well, I got connections here. Didn't get the job. In fact, even before that, I had an interview at the Waco Child Guidance Center, and that interview, I left there thinking I don't want to work here, because the guy who was doing the interview, he was, I'll never forget. He said to me, "I am not a counselor, I am a therapist." He said, "I do not have clients, I have patients." And then he said, "There really is an id. I know, I've seen one." So, okay, this guy's as Freudian as they get, and I don't think we're compatible. I didn't get that job. But anyway, then I had this interview at this drug rehab center, and with this guy that I thought, I got a real connection here. And I didn't get that job. And I'll never forget, he said to me, I don't think you've got the right background to work in. And I didn't. The closest I had done group therapy in the VA hospital in Waco, on the alcohol ward. But, other than that, he said, my advice to you would be to enlist in the Air Force. And be a psychologist there and finish your internship there. Because, at this point, I couldn't just go out on my own, because I still needed a whole year of internship. And I remember leaving there in a foul mood. It's like, this isn't what I want to do. And I certainly don't want to work in a drug rehab center, and I certainly don't want to, I want to I want to work with kids, children. And I left that guy's office, and I went back to the lake. I was madder than I was when I didn't get into graduate school. I don't think I prayed at all. I just screamed and yelled at the Lord and was chucking rocks in the lake. Again, anybody that saw me would have thought I was completely crazy. But this time I decided, at this point, I wasn't going to be a flight attendant with a doctorate. I decided there was this jazz nightclub in Dallas called the Taboo Room. It was called Strictly Taboo. And they also had a dining room, and they had the best pizza in Dallas. I decided out of rebellion that I'm going to go to live in Dallas and I'm going to be a bartender at the Taboo Room. And that way I can counsel drunks, I'm back out at Lake Waco, throwing rocks and screaming at God and yelling stuff like, can I get you another Manhattan? What, you want a beer? How about a margarita? Chucking rocks in there. Oh, your significant other dumped you? Oh, well, have another beer, you know. I was lividly angry, you know. I mean, here now I had a doctorate. I had applied for all these positions I wanted and I didn't get any of them. I had applied for positions I didn't want, but I was desperate and I didn't get them. And what am I going to do? What do you do with a, you know, I'm a psychological associate, so I could work under the supervision of somebody like in a school district, but I still need, you know, another year of internship. And, you know, what am I going to do? And so I'm screaming and yelling at the Lord. And when I was finally screamed out, I got in my car and drove home. It was a Friday. It was about 5 o'clock. And I started packing my suitcase to go to Dallas. I was going to camp out with an old roommate. I go to his apartment, sleep on the couch, and check out the taboo room. I'm packing my suitcase to go to Dallas, and the phone rang. It was Darlene Kaufman, the supervisor of testing for the Austin ISD. And she said, "You still want to work here?" I said, "Oh, sure." Yeah. She said, "Well, about an hour ago, that would have been while I was at the lake, chucking rocks in the water and screaming at God." She said, "About an hour ago, the school board approved your salary so we could hire you to work here." I finished packing my suitcase, and the next morning, her comment was, this is Friday at 5 o'clock, her comment was, "You start Monday at 8 o'clock in the morning." Okay. So I finished packing my suitcase, and the next day I drove to Austin instead of Dallas to look for an apartment. And I spent the whole day looking for an apartment and was about to give up because, you know, the school year was about to start, and all the students at the University of Texas had come back to town, and there weren't any apartments available anywhere. The last place I looked, I got an apartment. And it was downtown. And this is kind of funny too. Just as a side note, I had applied for all these different jobs, and I had a dream one night. This is when I was still living in Waco. And in my dream, I was getting a haircut. But it wasn't my Waco barber. And I didn't know where I was. And I thought, well, when I'm done getting a haircut, maybe I'll know where I am. And so, the guy finished cutting my hair. I paid him. And the barbershop didn't look familiar. Anyway, I walked out the front door of the barbershop, and it was on this really wide street. And I looked to the left, and there was the state capitol. And I remember thinking, "Oh wow, I'm in Austin." I'm on Congress Avenue in Austin. The only place I found to live. That Saturday, before I started work at it, Monday at 8 a.m., was at Congress Square Apartments, which are on the corner of Congress and Riverside. And if you walked out the front of the complex and you looked to the left, there was the state capitol. And if you went to the right, up the hill on South Congress, on the right-hand side, there was a barber shop. So that's how I ended up in Austin as a school psychologist. I'll stop here. The story on how I became a college professor will be my next testimony. Enjoy your day.